Some stories should never be told. Some truths should never be uncovered. But what would you do if, by a simple mistake, you ended up in the wrong place, at the wrong time? It was supposed to be just a trip. A detour on the road, a GPS with no signal, and a group of friends just trying to find their way back home. But what they found was something far worse. A village forgotten by time, a town hiding from the world, and a secret that was never meant to be revealed. They were warned. The whispers in the forest tried to alert them. The fearful stares of the villagers begged them to leave. But they didn't listen. And now they were trapped. With every cycle, a sacrifice must be made. A name must be chosen. Someone must be given, or what sleeps beneath the earth will awaken. But what if, this time, the sacrifice isn't enough? What if they never escape? The road was narrow and winding, swallowed by a thick fog that seemed to breathe around the car. The GPS had stopped working hours ago, and the last road sign they had seen was too rusted to read. Gabriel, sitting in the passenger seat, checked his phone every minute, hoping for a signal that never came. Sophia, at the wheel, tried to stay calm, but frustration was already clear on her face. In the back seat, Marcos and Livia whispered to each other, debating whether they should turn back or keep going. But turning back was no longer an option. There had been no sign of civilization for miles, and their gas tank was running low. The first time they saw the village, it was as if it had materialized out of nowhere. Small wooden houses scattered among the dense forest, surrounded by a rustic fence, as if trying to keep something out, or trap something inside. There were no streetlights, no phone towers, no cars on the dirt roads. Just an eerie, oppressive silence. When the car stopped at the entrance, a cold wind swept through, carrying the damp smell of old wood and wet earth. As soon as they stepped out of the car, they realized they were being watched. From the windows of the houses, curtains were quickly pulled shut, and silhouettes moved away. An old man, hunched over a twisted wooden cane, stood motionless in front of a small shop, his gaze locked on them. No smile, no greeting. Just a deep, empty stare. "This place is so wrong," Livia whispered, hugging herself as if she felt a cold the others couldn't. Gabriel cleared his throat, trying to shake off the tension. Maybe it's just a small, isolated village. They're probably not used to visitors. Or they don't want visitors, Marcos muttered, eyeing the cautious faces peeking from doors and porches. Sophia decided to approach the old man, hoping to get some information about the place. But as soon as she opened her mouth to ask something, he lifted his bony hand and pointed behind her, toward a crooked sign nailed to a wooden post. The paint was faded with time, but the words were still visible. "Strangers must not stay." The silence became even heavier. Sophia tried to laugh it off, as if it were some kind of local joke, but the old man remained still, his sunken, colorless eyes fixed on her. The other villagers, who had been watching from their houses, began shutting their doors, locking themselves in before the night fell. "I don't think we're welcome here," Marcos muttered, glancing up at the sky, which was darkening too fast. Sophia sighed, trying to keep her composure. "We just need a place to stay for the night. We'll figure out how to leave in the morning." But there were no inns or hotels. No businesses that suggested lodging. The only building that seemed large enough was an old church at the end of the main road. Its bell tower rose against the dark sky, and its stained glass windows seemed to twist the images of the saints carved into them. A priest appeared at the church door, a tall, thin man, dressed entirely in black. His face was unnaturally pale, almost colorless. He studied them for a moment before nodding slightly, inviting them inside. "If you need shelter, you may stay here for the night," he said, his voice low and dry. The group hesitated. There was something off about that church. But the alternative was sleeping in the car, stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by a forest where not a single animal seemed to move. No birds. No crickets. Just silence. They stepped inside. The interior of the church was even stranger than the outside. There were no pews for the faithful, only a vast open space lit by candles on stone pedestals. The main altar held an inverted cross, something nobody mentioned out loud, but everyone noticed. The priest closed the door behind them and locked it with a rusty key. "The night is not safe for outsiders. It's best if you stay inside the church until dawn." Before anyone could ask why, a sound cut through the silence of the village. Something coming from the forest. A distant murmur, like dozens of voices whispering at the same time. Sophia felt a shiver run down her spine. What is that?" The priest didn't answer. He simply walked toward the altar, knelt down, and began to pray in a language none of them recognized. Outside, the village plunged into darkness, and the whispers drew closer. The first hour inside the church was marked by an unsettling silence. The flickering candle flames cast distorted shadows on the stone walls, making it seem as if they were alive. The priest remained kneeling before the altar, his lips moving in an uninterrupted whisper of prayer in a language no one understood. Gabriel stared at the stained glass windows. The saints depicted in them were wrong. Their faces were elongated, their eyes hollow and lifeless. It was as if the glass hadn't been designed to inspire faith, but to remind those inside of something much darker. It was Marcos who finally broke the silence. "This place feels so wrong." No one disagreed. Livia kept her gaze fixed on the locked door. "We shouldn't be here." Then it happened. The first whisper. Faint. Distant. Coming from the forest outside the church. A soft, breathy voice, like the wind moving between the trees. Then another. And another. Multiple whispers, overlapping, each in a different tone. Some spoke quickly, others dragged their words as if struggling to be understood. But something was even worse. They were calling their names. Marcos. Gabriel. Livia. Sophia. The group stiffened. That was just the wind, right? Sophia whispered, more to herself than to the others. But it wasn't the wind. The whispers grew louder, circling the church, coming from all directions. The sound was getting closer. Something was walking among the trees. The rustling leaves and the snapping of branches made it clear, something was out there. "Don't listen," the priest finally said, still kneeling, without looking up from the altar. His voice was tight. "Don't answer. Don't look out the windows. Don't step outside." The group exchanged panicked glances. "What the hell is going on?" Livia backed away from the door, as if expecting something to break it down at any moment. The priest, still murmuring his prayer, simply repeated, "Don't listen. Don't answer. Don't look." But Gabriel, always the skeptic, couldn't hold back. "This is just superstition." He strode toward the door, ignoring the others' protests. "There's got to be a rational explanation for this." Before anyone could stop him, Gabriel cracked the door open and looked outside. For a moment, everything was silent. The village was swallowed in absolute darkness. No candlelight, no lamps in the houses. Just pitch-black shadows and the silhouettes of trees swaying in the cold wind. Gabriel squinted, trying to make out any details. And then he saw it. Someone was standing there, right in the middle of the empty street. A child. Thin. Fragile. Wearing a white, dirt-stained dress. Their head tilted slightly forward, as if observing something. Gabriel couldn't see the face clearly, the darkness concealed the details, but something about the shape was wrong. Then, the child took one step forward. Gabriel's heartbeat pounded against his ribs. His instinct screamed at him to shut the door. But something about the figure, the way it moved, kept him frozen. Then the pale glow of the moon illuminated the child's face. And terror hit him like a brick wall. The child had no face. Where the eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, pale surface. A complete void. Gabriel stumbled backward, swallowing a scream. The child lifted its head slightly. And despite having no eyes, he knew it was looking directly at him. Then it spoke. Not with the voice of a child, but with a low, ancient whisper, impossible to belong to anything human. "I see you." Gabriel staggered, his breath caught in his throat. The priest stood up abruptly. "Close the door." Sophia grabbed Gabriel's arm and slammed the door shut. Outside, the whispers resumed, stronger than before. But now, among the voices, a new sound stood out. Footsteps. Small, dragging footsteps, circling the church. The child was no longer standing in the street. It was moving. And whatever it wasn't alone. The church was engulfed in absolute silence, broken only by the group's ragged breathing. The priest kept his eyes closed, his lips moving in a continuous, desperate prayer. The whispers outside still echoed in their minds, like something trying to slip inside their thoughts. And then, suddenly, they stopped. No more sounds. No more movement. The silence was so sudden, It felt like it had sucked the air out of the church. Gabriel, still pale and shaking, pressed himself against the wall, running his hands over his face. This isn't possible, he whispered. Sophia kept her grip on the doorknob, as if expecting something to try and force it open at any moment. Marcos slowly stepped away from the window, not daring to look outside. Livia just hugged her knees, staring at the floor. Then, the priest finally spoke. "You were never supposed to be here." His voice was low, but it carried something they couldn't quite decipher. Fear? Resignation? Marcos was the first to snap out of his shock enough to respond. "We didn't want to be here." His voice trembled. "We got lost." What the hell was that outside? The priest took a deep breath, clasping his hands together. What is outside should never be seen. Gabriel let out a nervous laugh. Too late for that. The priest didn't argue. He simply stepped away from the altar and walked toward a side door that, until now, none of them had noticed. It was old wooden, scarred with deep scratches, as if something had clawed at it over and over again. "Follow me." The group hesitated. But what was the alternative? One by one, they followed the priest down a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air was different here. Damp, heavy, and something else. A metallic scent. The corridor led to a staircase of rough stone, spiraling downward into darkness. The flickering candlelight cast jagged shadows along the walls. "This doesn't feel right," Livia murmured. Sophia, walking just behind the priest, asked, "Where are we going?" The priest stopped in front of an iron door, rusted and covered in strange dark stains. He pulled out a ring of old keys and unlocked it, pushing it open with a slow grating creak. Beyond the door was a subterranean chamber, and at its center stood an altar covered in strange symbols, bones, and dried blood. Gabriel felt his stomach turn. What the hell is this? The priest stepped inside and touched the stone altar with reverence. His face was dark, burdened, as if carrying a weight no one else could see. "This is where those who came before you were sacrificed." The words hit them like a thunderclap. The air felt heavier, suffocating. The silence that followed was unbearable. Livia stumbled back, covering her mouth. "What?" The priest turned to face them, his gaze unwavering. "Every cycle, outsiders who arrive here must be sacrificed. It is the only way to keep what's outside contained." Sophia's heart pounded against her ribs. "No, this is insane." Gabriel shook his head violently, retreating. "This is some kind of cult? A ritual." "It's not a cult. It's not a ritual," the priest said darkly. "It's the only thing stopping the village from being devoured." And then, without warning, a thunderous bang echoed through the underground chamber. Something was pounding against the iron door. Something wanted in. The bang against the iron door echoed like a thunderclap through the underground chamber. Livia let out a choked scream, pressing her hands over her ears as if trying to block out the sound. Gabriel stumbled back, his fists clenched, his breath coming in short gasps. Sophia looked at the priest, expecting him to say it was just the wind, a trick of the mind. But he simply closed his eyes and murmured, "It's too late. He has already been chosen." The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. "What do you mean?" Marcos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The priest slowly opened his eyes and looked directly at Gabriel. "The child has chosen. He is this cycle's sacrifice." Gabriel let out a short, nervous laugh. "This is a joke, right?" The iron door trembled again, but this time, something whispered from the other side. It wasn't a normal whisper. Not the wind slipping through cracks or some distant sound. This was a voice. Cold. Precise. Like a knife scraping against glass. "Gabriel." A chill ran down his spine. His name. The faceless child was outside the door. "Open. Open it now." Gabriel's body went rigid, his pulse hammering. The priest stepped forward sharply. "Do not open that door." Marcos grabbed Sophia's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." But no one moved. The air around the altar was thick, suffocating, pressing down on them like an invisible weight. The whisper came again, this time right at the door. "He belongs to me." And then, silence. No more pounding. No more whispers. Gabriel looked at the others, his skin damp with cold sweat. Is it over?" Then, the church bells rang. 3 deep, echoing chimes. The priest flinched. He is here. And then, the iron door creaked open, by itself. In the dark corridor beyond, the faceless child stood waiting. It raised one hand and pointed at Gabriel. And in that instant he knew. He had no choice. Gabriel felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. The faceless child stood motionless in the corridor, its hand still pointing at him. The rest of the group couldn't move. Time seemed to slow. Gabriel's own heartbeat pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, it started walking. Small, dragging steps. A dry, rhythmic sound, as if its feet barely touched the ground. The priest stretched out a hand and gripped Gabriel's shoulder tightly, his voice almost a whisper. "Don't run. If you run, it will chase you." But Gabriel couldn't help himself. He stepped backward. And that was enough. The child tilted its head slightly. And then, it rushed at him. Too fast. Way too fast. The others screamed as the figure blurred toward him, a pale shadow darting down the corridor. Gabriel tripped, falling backward onto the stone altar. The impact left him dazed, but before he could get up, the child was already on him. Its cold fingers touched his face. And then, visions. Gabriel saw distorted faces, mouths open in silent screams, hands clawing at stone walls, fingernails broken from the effort. He saw bodies being dragged through the forest, wide-eyed and frozen in terror. Men and women clutching their own throats as something pulled them beneath the earth. He felt everything. The pain. The despair. The absolute horror. These were the others. The ones who came before him. The sacrificed. The weight of the curse crashed down on him like an anchor. He wasn't just seeing the victims of the past. He was becoming one of them. The cold touch on his skin deepened, and Gabriel felt something inside him being pulled away. It was as if his soul was being drained, sucked into that empty void where the child's face should have been. And then the child spoke. "Now, you are one of us." And everything went black. The darkness around Gabriel wasn't just the absence of light. It was something alive, pulsing, a presence that slithered over his skin and burrowed into his mind. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. There was no air, no space, just an endless, consuming void. Then, the whispers started again. But now, they were inside him. "You belong to us." A burning pain spread through his chest, like fire racing through his veins. It was as if something was trying to rip him out of his own body. His hands trembled. His heart pounded so fast, it felt like it was trying to break free from his ribs. Outside, Sophia, Marcos, and Livia watched in horror as Gabriel's body convulsed on the stone floor. His eyes were wide open, but completely black, reflecting nothing but emptiness. "What's happening to him?" Livia cried, grabbing Marcos's arm. The priest knelt before the altar, pressing his hands against the cold, blood-stained stone. "The ritual has begun." Sophia rushed forward, shaking Gabriel violently, but his body was rigid as stone. His mouth suddenly fell open, his lips stretching unnaturally wide, as if something was trying to crawl out from inside him. Then, all the candles around them went out at once. Darkness swallowed the chamber. And then, a voice. An impossible voice. A voice that was not Gabriel's. "You have brought him to me. And now you want to stop me." Sophia stumbled backward. Marcos pulled Livia away. The thing inside Gabriel laughed. A deep, distorted sound, as if multiple voices were laughing at once. Then, Gabriel's body moved. Not like a person. Like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. His head twitched. His limbs bent at odd angles. The air around them turned ice cold. And something crawled out of his shadow. A grotesque, shifting form, translucent yet impossibly dark. It stretched upward, looming over them, its features unclear, except for its eyes. Two burning, red slits. The priest tightened his grip on the dagger resting on the altar. "Step back." But it was too late. The shadow lunged forward, and something that looked like an arm struck the priest in the chest. The impact threw him against the stone wall with a sickening crunch. He didn't get back up. Sophia screamed. Livia clutched Marcos, sobbing. And Gabriel, or whatever had taken his body, turned toward them. "You're next." Gabriel's eyes were empty, deep as an abyss with no end. The skin around his mouth trembled, as if something inside him was writhing, trying to break free. Sophia felt a cold grip around her heart. That wasn't Gabriel anymore. Gabriel. Her voice came out weak, barely audible. His body jerked violently, as if pulled by invisible strings. His neck twisted with a sickening crack, and a crooked smile stretched across his face. But his eyes remained lifeless, void of anything human. "He can't hear you anymore." The voice wasn't his. It was deeper layered, echoing as if spoken by multiple mouths at once. Livia choked on a sob, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Marcos swallowed hard, stepping back, his breath uneven. The priest gripped the dagger tighter. "We don't have time. We have to complete the ritual." But no one moved. The air grew heavy, dense, as if the space around them was folding in on itself. The walls of the underground chamber began to bleed, dark cracks forming as thick, black liquid oozed from the stone. The ground trembled, and the extinguished candles suddenly reignited, but this time their flames were blue and unstable. This can't be real," Marcos whispered, sweat dripping down his face. Then, the thing inside Gabriel laughed. A sound so twisted, so inhuman, it sent shivers down their spines. "You brought him to me. And now you think you can stop me?" Gabriel's body lurched upward, his limbs stretching unnaturally. Bones popped and cracked under his skin as he grew taller, his shadow expanding behind him. And then, it stepped out. A dark, pulsating entity, shifting and writhing as if struggling to take a stable form. Its face was undefined, but its eyes, they burned red. The priest raised the dagger with both hands. "Step back." But it was too late. The shadow moved, and something resembling an arm shot forward, slamming into the priest's chest. The impact sent him crashing against the stone wall, his body crumpling lifelessly to the ground. Sophia screamed. Marcos grabbed Livia, pulling her away. And Gabriel, or whatever was controlling him, turned to them. "You're next." Sophia grabbed Marcos and Livia by the arms, her feet slipping on the dirt-covered stone floor. The thing that once was Gabriel stared at them with a hollow, hungry gaze, the grotesque shadow behind him writhing like a living entity. "Run!" Marcos shouted, but no one needed to be told twice. They bolted down the dark corridor, their footsteps echoing wildly against the walls. The air turned colder, each breath visible in the dim light. Something was chasing them. The tunnel stretched endlessly. Every turn led to another passage identical to the last, as if they were running in circles. The only illumination came from flickering blue flames on candles lining the walls, casting shadows that did not belong to them. "This isn't right." Livia sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "We should have reached the end by now." Sophia risked a glance behind her. It was a mistake. The creature was racing toward them, but its feet never touched the ground. Its body pulsed, shifting like liquid darkness, moving faster than anything humanly possible. "Don't stop!" Marcos yelled. Then, the passage ahead vanished. The ground beneath them collapsed as if the very fabric of reality had been torn apart. Sophia tried to stop, but it was too late. They fell. But it wasn't a normal fall. Time twisted around them, stretching endlessly. The whispers that once came from the forest now echoed inside their heads, overlapping, overlapping, overlapping. "You were never supposed to be here. He brought us back. The cycle must continue. You will never leave." Then, impact. Sophia gasped for air and opened her eyes. She was back in the village. But something was different. The sky, once dark, now had a permanent reddish glow, as if it was always about to dawn but never quite did. The houses looked older, distorted, like they had been abandoned for centuries. The windows were covered with blackened cloth, and at the end of the street, the church was gone. Livia sat up beside her, dirt covering her tear-streaked face. What happened? Marcos scanned their surroundings, his face pale. Did we escape? Then they saw the car, parked at the village entrance. Exactly where they had left it. But something made them freeze. Inside the car, sitting in the same positions, were themselves. Not moving. Not breathing. Frozen in the exact moment they first arrived. Then the worst part. Their copies inside the car turned their heads toward them, and smiled. Sophia felt her stomach drop. And then she understood. They had never escaped. Sophia's blood ran cold. She blinked several times, trying to process what she was seeing. They were inside the car, exactly as they had been when they first arrived. Marcos in the passenger seat, Gabriel checking his phone, Livia staring out the window. But something was wrong. The versions of them inside the car weren't moving. Their eyes were wide open, staring into nothing. They looked like lifeless dolls, frozen in time. "This isn't real," Marcos muttered, his voice trembling. Livia stepped back, her hands covering her mouth. "Are we dead?" Before Sophia could answer, the car engine roared to life. The figures inside remained still, their blank, unblinking eyes fixed on them. Then, almost in perfect synchronization, they began to smile. Slow. Wrong. Their mouths stretched too far. Their teeth were too sharp. Their eyes were too empty. Sophia stumbled backward, colliding with Marcos, who stood frozen in place. "Run." His voice was barely a whisper. The car suddenly accelerated, its tires kicking up dust as it sped toward them. But it didn't move forward. It came straight at them. Sophia yanked Livia out of the way just in time. The car crashed violently into a tree, but instead of crumpling on impact, it disappeared. The silence that followed was worse than any scream. Then, the village bell tolled. 1, 2, 3 times. Sophia felt an unbearable pressure in her head. Livia collapsed to her knees, clutching her ears. Marcos squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the whispers that had returned, growing louder and louder. And then, they weren't alone anymore. The houses began to open their doors all at once. They came out. The villagers, once hidden, were now standing in the open, staring at them. But their faces weren't human. They were smooth. No eyes, no mouths. Just pale, stretched skin where their expressions should have been. And they were all pointing at Gabriel. Except, Gabriel wasn't there anymore. He's already gone. A cold feminine voice echoed behind them. Sophia turned slowly. The faceless child was there. And behind it, Gabriel stood motionless. His eyes, once black as void, now burned with an unnatural red glow. The child smiled. The cycle is complete, but it will begin again. And then, reality shattered. Sophia, Marcos, and Livia were pulled backward, as if something invisible had swallowed them whole. The village vanished. The sky turned black. Sound ceased to exist. A final scream echoed. And then, silence.